Hi everyone, and we are going to sketch out ideas for an Apple Watch charger dock. And up here I have a picture of the dimensions of an Apple Watch charger, and this disc here and its cord are what we're going to need to worry about for making a hole in our dock that we build so that we can actually fit it in there. So we can see the outside diameter of this is almost 28 millimeters. So when we go about creating our piece, we're going to need a hole that's 28, or possibly to accommodate for any little expansion, we'll make it 29, and a slot that is next to it, where this has a width of 5.25. So let's make this at least 6. And the whole thing is about 7 millimeters tall. So we're going to want that depth of a cut in there so it sits flush with the top, so it won't stick out above our thing. And we'll be creating a simple stand that you can add more details to as you like. But we're going to give it some body that can hold up the watch at an angle, and our hole in here and our slot for our cable to go by. We want this to stand up, and we're going to have to put the watch on from the side here, which means that we're going to need our stand to come down from here and our slot to continue down so we can keep that cable from just sticking out the side, and then a base which is going to be a little bit heavier than the top so that it's not likely to tip over. I'm keeping this design simple so that we can do something like print it on this side at the end. But we can use the power of 3D printing to customize this in any way or add other embellishments very easily. And we'll get started with our design. And we are going to put together a design for a simple Apple Watch charging stand. It's going to use the existing charger. So we have the dimensions for the cable and the charger we're going to make our hole out of, and then we'll put together out of some boxes this simple stand. So let's get started with the hole. I'm going to move my example off to the side here, and we're going to bring in a cylinder that's already set to hole. We're going to use our dimensions that we got earlier. First, I'm going to turn the number of sides all the way up so that the cylinder is as smooth as possible. And then we're going to make this 29 millimeters on each side. That extra millimeter is to compensate for any expansion in the plastic. So we make sure that we have just a tiny bit of a gap. It's a 0.5 millimeter on all the way around so that we know that it will fit. Just so that I get the height correct, I'm going to put this at 7 millimeters. And then we are going to make a hole for the cable that comes out of the side. So let's bring in another cylinder here. I'm going to crank the sides all the way up to keep it smooth. And we're going to make this 6 millimeters on a side. 6 and tab and 6. Remember that anytime you see a number on the screen, if I click on a handle here, I can select the number and type in the millimeters directly so that I can get my measurements without having to drag things around until they get correct. Now, if I take the rotate tool, which can be hard to click on There we go. And keep my mouse inside of the circle so it'll snap. I'll snap it to 90 degrees. And then I'll hit D on the keyboard. There's no on-screen button for this, but I remember it as D for drop to put it on the ground. And I'm probably pretty close to the middle, but let's make sure that this is correct by selecting both of them and going to our Align tool and clicking on the middle button here. So now our shapes are aligned. Right now we have the shape of the object that we want to insert. But if we're inserting this from the top, this hole is going to give us a round top here, which means we're going to have space above it that will be covered with plastic. There'll be no way to get that wire in there. So we're going to need the top part of this hole to be an additional hole. So let's bring in a box. We're going to click on our size here and go ahead and make this 6 as well. And then we're going to line this up with our existing cylinder. So I'll select the two of them, click on Align, and I don't want to move this one out of place. So I'm going to click on the cylinder again, and you can see all the Align handles move to the cylinder. So I'm going to center it in both directions on the cylinder there. And then I'm going to click on an empty space to deselect those two. We'll click on this one. And I want to use the cylinder to keep the inside of my hole round, just for aesthetics. So I'm going to instead move this up. And since we know this is a diameter of 6, I'm just going to move it up 3 millimeters. Just like when I change the size, you can see that when I change the height, I can always click on this number and say I want it 3 millimeters high. Now we have this cutting in the way here. We don't need to worry about how tall this is because we want to cut a hole out the top of our object. That way we can fit our cable in. But just to make this a little bit less of a nuisance, I can shrink this down a bit so it's not sticking up so high. Now I'll go ahead and turn all of these holes into one shape so that I can't misalign them. I'll select all of the holes. I'm going to make sure that I don't select any solid shapes. You can see that since I touched my example over there, if I were to group them, the holes will disappear because they are attempting to cut out a shape that they don't overlap on. Let's ungroup that. If I select only holes, you can see I have 3 shapes and they're all holes. When I click on group, the holes will be put together into a single shape that is ready to cut out of another object. So let's get our top piece here. I'm going to drag a box in. And right now, since I know this is 7, I'm going to drag this down to 7 so that the top is flush with the top of this hole. I don't want my stand to be sticking up higher than this and stop the little magnet in here from being able to grip onto the watch. Let's stretch our shape out here. We don't want this to be too big, but we want it to be a little bit bigger than this on all sides. And just to make this whole thing look a little nicer, I'm going to go ahead and increase the radius. The radius here, you can see, rounds out the corners. If you go too far, it becomes practically a sphere. So let's just turn up the radius a little bit so that we will end up with a box with round corners. And let's select both of our objects here, use the Align tool again to make sure that they line up in the center. All right, I need some space, more space on this side, because I know I'm going to have an arm going down here to the base, but this is looking good. Now, if I cut it out right now by grouping these together, our shape here is going to cut all the way through to the bottom, and our main disc here is going to cut all the way through our shape, so it's going to fall out the back. Since I know I want this to be flush with this surface, I'm going to select this object, and instead of changing its height and moving it up and down, I'm going to rotate my view with the right mouse button and look at it from the bottom. When we are looking at it from the bottom, you can see our height measurement has appeared on the bottom of our object. So if I click on the height measurement and drag it down, I can increase it a few millimeters. And we can see that it has gone down below the surface here. So when we cut this out, it is not going to go all the way through. Now before we do cut this out, I'm going to need this piece for the continuation of our cable channel down the side. So I'm going to click on our shape here and duplicate it, which is Control D on the keyboard, or this duplicate and repeat button. This has made a copy in the exact same spot. I'm just going to use my arrow keys to move it out to the side over here, since I'm going to reuse part of it later. Now let's go ahead and group these together. And we can raise the top of our shape up until we are tall enough where we want the top of our watch to be. We're going to go ahead and rotate this to 45 degrees. So when we put our watch on the charger, the screen will be easily visible from the side. All right, and now we're going to need some boxes in order to finish our project. Let's grab another box here, give it a little bit of roundness on the corners by increasing the radius a little bit. Then we will change this to about 10 millimeters wide and stretch it up until it connects with our shape. You can see that this isn't going to be a very good connection, so I'm going to have to cut this corner off. I'll worry about that when I cut the channel. So let's go ahead and move this with our arrow keys over to the side so that it lines up. And then we're going to ungroup our previous shape. We'll get rid of our disc here. Just use this to create our wire channel down the side. I'm going to group those two holes together again by themselves. We're going to use our rotate handle here to turn this 90 degrees so it stands on its end. And then we're going to use our arrow keys, since it's still lined up, to just move it over into this. Let's take the top handle and raise it all the way up until it will connect with the hole from our upper part here. So let's zoom in and make sure that we have everything lined up. And I can see that we'll have a little bit of a disconnect here. So let's click on our upper area and ungroup it so that we can see where our holes are and make sure everything lines up. We can go ahead and select our lower hole here, and we can nudge it to the side. You can see that moving 1 millimeter is a little bit too much for this. So we'll go to our snap grid and click on 0.25. So we move it 1/4 of a millimeter at a time. Now I can step through, make sure that these holes line up. Now that that's looking good, I know that I need to cut through all of these but I need to get rid of this corner here. So since I have a 45-degree box right here already, I'll go ahead and duplicate it in place. We'll turn this new duplicate, without moving it, into a hole. So I have a hole directly on top of my original shape. I'll turn the radius off here so that it has sharp edges. And then I'm going to hold down Shift and grab my top handle to increase the size until it covers up that entire corner. Now we can see that my hole has covered up the protruding corner. I only want to cut the corner off with this hole, so I'm going to hold down Shift and select the arm here. And then we will group the two shapes together, removing that top corner. Now we can see I've got overlapping holes that are ready to make my cable channel. Everything looks good. And lastly, I'm going to need a base. So before I group these again, let's zoom out here, grab another box, put it right there, and I can change my snap back to 1 millimeter again, so it's easy enough to line everything up. And we'll go ahead and make this 10 millimeters as well, and stretch our base out so that it's a little bit bigger than the top, making the base a little bit heavier. And we'll go ahead and increase the radius just a bit so it has some nice round corners as well. Now that we have all of our shapes in position, let's drag a box around everything and group them. Now we can check that our holes all line up, and we have a space for our cable channel to come out and turn downwards. Everything is looking good. You can use this technique, starting with this, to create any number of customizations on this. The beauty of 3D printing lets you make as many variations as you want. You can go so far as to use the same shapes to cut out holes in things and create something truly ridiculous to hold up your watch. But now we will set up one of our regular watch stands here to find the easiest way to print it. See you then. Lesson, we are going to export our Apple Watch stand for printing, and we're going to see what orientation and settings will make for the best printing and supports. So we're going to select our object here and click on Export. I want to download an STL, and I only want the selected shape so that I don't get anything else that is separate from it that might be floating around in my design or some of my hidden examples. And we'll click on STL. Now we've got our charging stand downloaded as an STL. We're going to move over to Cura for slicing. Here in our slicer software, we want to make sure that we have our printer set up and the plastic that we're going to use selected so we have the correct settings. And we're going to go in here and open up this watch stand. And right away, we can see that it has some red highlights on it. Red highlights in this program are faces that are facing downward that don't have anything underneath them to support them. It is red around the edges of this because of the rounded corners. The rounded corners actually round off the bottom as well. So it goes slightly up from the surface here. So that's not the best. However, the most dangerous part of this is our very large overhang here. Now, if we were to leave the supports off and create our slice like this. Zoom in here and look at the preview, and we will see that our layers are going to be printed just fine down here. But once we reach our very large overhang, we're going to have an area where the bottom corner is printed, but it's not attached to anything. And that is just going to dump plastic out in the air to curl around and cool down into what just looks like a bunch of spaghetti. Once we even connect here, we are going to have a large area where we have to print by going out and coming back. And since all of this is going to be spaghetti drooping down here, it's going to be quite a while before we get something that actually sticks onto the edge here. And that is where we come to generating supports. Now by default, if I generate some supports here, the printer is going to find the areas that have nothing underneath them, and it's going to go ahead, and we can see them highlighted as blue. It's going to make a tower of support lines that are connected very slightly to both sides of our model. So they should be easy to remove. However, even though our connection is not super strong with the supports, we have this wrapping around the entire column. It adds a lot of time and a lot of plastic to the print, and it's going to be very difficult to pull out, as we're going to have to cut into these supports in order to get it out from around here. So to solve this problem, we're going to change the orientation of our print so that we don't have so much overhangs. Let's go ahead and return to prepare. I'm going to click on my object here and go to our rotate. Now, while we can't change the shapes, the individual components of our project now, we can, in fact, rotate, scale, and move our part around the floor of the printer. And for this, I am going to use the select a face to align here. I could rotate this 90 degrees. Since I know that this is straight up and down, that should put it directly on the floor. But since I have this option, I can click on this and then click on the face of the object that I want to be on the floor. Let's try that one more time. Select. There it goes. And now I've rotated this side so that it is flat on the ground. And the area that is touching the floor is highlighted in blue since it's facing down but is supported completely by the floor of the printer. Now we can see I have red here in these areas that curve upwards because of our rounded corners, as well as on the inside of our wire and of our hole here. Now if I build supports, we're still going to be filling this area in. Let's slice it and take a look. And in our preview, we're going to have quite a big chunk of material to try to pull out of there after it's done. And we can see that the few layers of support that go underneath these curved edges don't seem to do much. And we have a thing of supports to fill this entire channel. While this might help with making this perfectly circular, we can probably do without supports. And if we take a look at our layers by slicing it without supports, you can see just how that might be the case. Up here, we may need some help. This edge might end up being pretty rough. But once we get down here, you can see that unlike the overhangs that were completely unsupported over here, our circle overhangs are very slightly growing. Each time they are one line just barely overlapping the one before it. As we get closer to the edge, we have longer and longer overlaps, so they're in danger of drooping down until we get to this layer here, where we're going to make a bridge. And a bridge is any place where we have to cross an open space while drawing our lines with plastic. So this whole area here might droop a bit as we try to bridge this gap. This could be a problem for fitting our shape in perfectly. Oops. Looks like I have accidentally moved everything. So let's undo that. Turn off our rotate tool there. We can see that up on the inside of this channel, we have a much shorter bridge. As we get down here, you can see that each one of these will end up bridging back and forth as it draws a long line above it. And this should easily be enough to be supported. If we want our circles to come out smoother and stronger, we can change the quality, also known as the layer height. This is going to increase the amount of time that it takes as we're going to cut it into thinner and thinner layers. But it also means, if I go up here to dynamic quality, 0.16 millimeters per layer, that with more layers means that each step of our circle is a shorter distance. So as we come up towards the top, we can see that all of these much thinner lines barely overlap each other, all the way until we get to a much shorter bridge here at the top. All of this means that there will be less drooping on this side and less for us to clean up at the end. And it's going to add a couple of hours to our print time. So now, without needing to remove supports, we can try and print this and see how it comes out.